Whoa, slow down. Before you take that next sale from a customer that seems like a slam dunk, have you stopped to ask your customer, your potential customer, a couple of very important questions? Hey, my name's Blake Benz. I'm the host of the Good Advice podcast, and we're talking a little sales advice today. More importantly, we're talking about the kinds of questions that you absolutely must ask your next potential buyer, lest you risk having a bad customer. Sometimes we have bad customers not because we did a bad job, but because, well, some customers are just not great customers. Let's talk about how to avoid those kinds of customers by asking two very simple questions that'll also help you establish yourself as a more credible and reliable provider, and it might even let you charge more in your services as a result. Before we get into today's episode, though, we have a word from one of the amazing businesses that sponsors the podcast. Hey, by the way, if you love the podcast, you want to support the podcast, you can always check out our Patreon at patreon.com/goodadvice, where you can support the podcast for as little as the price of a cup of coffee, only $5. I feel like I always need to say that, by the way, because these days you never know how much a cup of coffee could be, right? But also, if you're a business and you've ever thought about advertising, you might think about advertising on the Good Advice podcast. And you can always reach out about that at blake@goodadvicecoaching.com. All right, there's my spiel. Let's get into it right after this ad. See you soon. There's one single piece of advice that I give to business owners who are ready to scale their business drastically. And that's knowing exactly what you need to hand off so that you can continue focusing on what you're an expert in. It amazes me when I talk to business owners who are doing their own bookkeeping and tax prep, and worse, that they're going through all this paperwork at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, even midnight, slaving away trying to make sense of all of the numbers for their business. Business owners who are making it happen have already figured out that you can't do it all yourself. That's why I recommend Steve Lay with Equity Business Solutions. Not only is he an expert in bookkeeping and tax prep, but what I love about Steve is that he'll sit down with you and help you make sense of the value of your business beyond just reading a spreadsheet. You'll be able to make better decisions, and more importantly, you're going to save yourself the crucial time you would have spent going through QuickBooks or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is that keeps us up late at night. So save yourself some time and some money by giving Steve Lay a call at Equity Business Solutions, and he'll show you the value beyond your numbers. Go to equitybusinesssolutionsllc.com to find out more. So there are two questions that I love to ask. Technically three. This is going to be one of those episodes where I boil it down to here's a couple things you need to do. Oh, and also here's maybe something else you can do. And I'm going to try to keep myself from getting too out of control here on all the different things you could ask. And we're just going to walk through a couple of things that you're going to want to keep top of mind whenever you're on your next sales call or your next sales conversation. And if you do these things very well, it's going to protect you from a bad customer. Now, if you've been in business long enough, you can probably think of those customers that were an absolute slam dunk. They were so happy. They ended up being a repeat customer. They sent you more business. You know, they are one of your best referral sources. And to this day, you think, if I could have more customers like that, I'd be living it, right? I'd be mega rich. I would have just an incredibly stress-free, awesome business. For me personally, one of my customers that I think of is Ronald McDonald House Charities. They were my first customer. They've been a customer for 6 years. They are incredibly easy to work with. They're incredibly just an amazing business. And so if I had every customer like them, that would be pretty special. Alas, you simply don't have every customer like that customer. If you've been in business long enough, you can probably think of one or two customers where you say, ooh, I wish I had not taken that customer. Now, I'm not even talking so much about customers that you do a bad job with, which, by the way, I think sometimes this happens where We have a customer who they really like working with us. You're doing whatever it is you do for them. And they say, hey, by the way, I like you enough. I trust you enough. Can you do this other thing that's kind of outside your wheelhouse? And, you being someone wanting to help and wanting to, of course, be a great provider for your customer, you say yes against your better judgment. Ignoring the fact that it's outside of your expertise, ignoring the fact that maybe you're not the best fit for that, and you give it a shot, and oops, it didn't work out so well. At our Tuesday morning meetup this morning, one of our participants was actually sharing a story about this, of how she took on a project that she probably shouldn't have, and now after the fact, she's like, "Yep, I don't think I'll do that again." We've all been there. We've all lived that. I'm not talking about that kind of customer, though. I'm talking about, if I can just put it plainly, the customer from hell, the customer where you realize after the fact they were never going to be happy. They were never going to be satisfied with your work. They were incredibly difficult to deal with. And even if they're not like malicious, even if they're not like totally, maybe malicious is the wrong word. They're ornery. Is that a weird word? I don't know. Like, even if they're not like purposely mean, they're just extremely high maintenance. They're over involved in the project. They want far more updates than the average person does. They provide their feedback and criticism on things that they don't really have much of a full understanding of. I was in a conversation about this with a friend of mine for his business, and he was sharing about how, sometimes you'll have a good example. Let's take like the digital marketing world, for example. You'll have a customer who's like hyper focused on a very specific metric. Like you have a dashboard of numbers, a dashboard of like different statistics, and you have a customer who's hyper focused on one specific number that really isn't that important a number anyway. And so you have to spend all this time sort of diffusing the intensity around that number, diverting their attention to the other numbers that actually do matter. And at the end of the day, you almost spend as much time dealing with the customer as you are actually delivering on the great work. Many of us have had at least one customer like this. And again, not that every customer like this is like, purposefully a bad customer. It's just that some customers they're just hard to satisfy. They're hard to work with. And like I said, we end up after the fact looking back at that customer and saying, man, you know what? At the time, I really thought I wanted that customer, and I wish I hadn't taken them. I wish, even though I needed the money, even though it was great for my bottom line revenue, what have you, I wish in retrospect we had said no to that kind of customer. Well, there's a couple of things that you can ask. There's 2 questions that you can ask, maybe 3. 2 questions you can ask that will help avoid this kind of customer in the future. Now, first things first, whenever you are selling your services to a buyer, you've probably heard the expression, the customer is always right. And there's a lot of like dialogue and even like quotables around really establishing the customer from like this perspective or like this point of authority. And I'm trying to think about how to describe this without making me sound any sort of way. The bottom line is that when you think of your customers, it's not your job to necessarily beat to their drum. I'm paying you for a service. You do what I tell you to. Like, these are all hallmarks of a pretty bad customer. Really great customers, they understand that the work is collaborative. They understand that they don't know what you do know. Hence, that's why they're paying you, is because they don't have your expertise, or maybe they don't have the time that they want to devote to it. So they're willing to allow someone else to spend the time on that. But regardless of whatever circumstance it is, whenever you're selling to someone, you very much want to force sounds the wrong word. You want to engage in a conversation where they're selling themselves to you as well. They're selling why are they a great customer for you. And it's not so much like, hey, prove to me why I should take you on. It's actually more of you are thinking of the customers you currently have, and you're thinking, do I really want to add this person to my portfolio of work? Do I want to add this project to the list of projects that I'm doing? Or don't I? Is this going to ultimately be a great customer? Or is this ultimately going to be a huge pain in my rear? So here's 2 questions you can ask to always figure this out from the get-go. The first question I always like to ask, and I sell really 3 different services at this point in my business with Good Advice and Podcastable. I sell the consulting package, I sell the podcastable podcast production, and I sell the advertising on the Good Advice podcast. No matter the context, no matter what someone's buying, I always ask this question: have you bought something like this before? Have you paid for something like this before? Because their answer to this is going to clue you in to a few different things about this customer. First of all, it's going to clue you in on the incorrect expectations they may have about hiring your service. So let's take like the podcast advertising, for example. So I might be in a conversation with someone and they say, hey, I want to buy some advertising on your show. Well, I ask, have you ever bought an ad before? Have you ever bought online advertising? Have you ever bought a podcast ad before? Well, if they say no, then now it's on me to try to figure out exactly what are their expectations about that ad. Now, this isn't to devalue the podcast ad at the start of this episode, but I want to be very clear about a couple things about advertising in general. It is incredibly rare that someone sees an ad for the first time, stops what they're doing, and goes and buys that thing. It's incredibly rare. More often than not, the ad that someone sees that causes them to buy is the 7th or 8th thing they've seen from your brand. They've been thinking about you, and that ad popped up at just the right moment when they were already on the edge of buying or not buying. Okay? So ad buying, it's rare. It's rare that someone is going to hear it or see it and instantly make a purchase. It's rare, especially if the price point is higher. So when I ask the question, have you ever bought an ad before? Have you ever paid for advertising? If the person says no, well, their misconception about advertising could be that there's a direct tie between ads and dollars earned. That there's a direct tie between ads and amount sold. And there is a direct tie there, but it's not at probably the pacing they're expecting. They probably don't understand that marketing in general is a long game. It would be like, for example, if you ran a social media company and someone hired you to handle the social media for their business. Well, if you didn't ask this question, have you ever paid for social media social media work before? What's keeping this person from getting angry at you and saying, hey, your social media work didn't generate any sales for my business? Now, if you've been working with them for a year, this might be a fair comment to make. If you've been working with them for 2 days and you've made 1 post, this is someone who does not understand the industry that is social media content creation. So whatever you sell, it's to your advantage to ask the question, have you bought this before? Because it may mean that you need to, I don't want to say you're not assuming they have like an unhealthy perspective, but they might have some misconceptions about your business that you've never considered before. They may have some misconceptions that are it's going to set you up for long-term failure or a frustrated customer when really you're doing everything you should be doing. So I like to ask that question first, and then from there I like to gauge expectations, like to set expectations on here's what this was what this looks like now. Now, after I ask that question, I'll typically check in and say, hey, do you still want to buy this now? Now that you understand what this really looks like, do you still want to pay for this? The other question I like to ask is, and this one has a little bit more of I don't say like a negative connotation for it. I mean, yeah, it's a negative connotation. I like to ask the question, what's your budget? Now, I think I was talking to a customer of mine in the past about this, and he said the way he described it to me was that he actually hates this question as a buyer. He said, I hate that question as a buyer because if I tell you my budget, you are going to scale the cost up to what my budget is instead of just telling me how much does it cost. And I think part of that's fair. I try to be fairly transparent in my process, really from like the first probably 2 or 3 minutes into the conversation, I'm trying to say price. And part of that is just to get us on the same page. Part of that is to just save me time. I was talking to a person a couple of weeks ago who we sat down. She said, "Hey, I want to hire you." And I mean, it was probably like the second or third sentence. I said, "Hey, I typically cost for this consulting package." I said, "The price is typically about $5,000." And she about doubled over. Holy crap. That is not at all what I was expecting. It's not at all what I was anticipating. There is absolutely no way I could ever pay for that, or I couldn't right now. Good day, sir. Very polite. Everything was very positive, polite, but it now saved me. You know, it'll save you from having like the 45-minute conversation, rather than, you know, you're deep in this conversation, then finally you talk about price. And I think, by the way, another reason why I really like to lead with price is because sometimes I think where we get backwards on like the sales, it's this conversation of like improving something that doesn't need to be improved. I think a lot of times we get onto ourselves for not being a better salesperson. And so like we get to the end of the conversation and we say the price and they're like, "Oh, I can't afford that." And then we're disappointed in ourselves because we're like, "Oh man, like what did I do wrong? Why didn't I close the sale? Like I must have done X, I need to do X, Y, and Z differently." And you actually didn't do anything wrong. It's just that person was never going to spend that amount on you. It was never going to happen. That's not a challenge, by the way. That's not well, maybe they would if, no, they weren't going to. In their mind, they thought $100. Okay. They maybe would spend 200 or 250. They weren't thinking $5,000. They were not anywhere close to that number. Right. So I think it's a bit silly sometimes how we get onto ourselves for, what do I need to do different, when it's like, no, this person was not a buyer from the get-go. Okay. On that note, that is why I like to lead with these kinds of numbers and these kinds of conversations from the get-go, is because it just saves me time, right? So I'm a big fan of transparency. I've mentioned on the podcast, I really love Todd Capone. I love his content around being a transparent salesperson. This is what I do. This is what I sell. This is what it costs. This is what it'll do for you. If it's a great fit, let's keep talking. If it's not a great fit, hey, we saved both of ourselves some time, take it easy, etc. You get it. But separate from the conversation around the price point, I really enjoy asking, not even so much what's your budget. Another way I like to ask it is, hey, how much of a priority is this for you right now? Because you never want to because here's where there's friction, is when you have a higher price point on something and the other person it's not even in their top 10 for priorities. It's like number 45 on the things that they care about. Like they called you not because it was pain point number one. They called you because they're on like a 2.5 hour car ride and they're bored out of their mind. And they thought about, oh yeah, I wonder what, I'm gonna give that person a call. And you were eager and excited because you thought you popped in their head as like number one or number two or number three on their list of priorities, when really it was, bottom of the list. And again, just out of convenience, they gave you a phone call. So budget and urgency, I have found, are very closely tied together. When someone has a problem that is urgent for them to solve, or it is a high priority thing for them to fix, they will typically pay more. Now, here's where you have a real opportunity is if when I ask the question, how important is this to you right now? And someone says, oh, there is nothing more important than this in my business right now. And then you say your price point, or you ask for the budget and they say, oh, my budget's $100. That's a great opportunity, not as a tricky, smart salesperson. It's not about manipulation. It's your job as someone who's trying to lead them along to make the right decision, whether that's with you or recommending they go elsewhere or what have you. That's an opportunity for you to point out, okay, well, you're telling me this is the number one most important thing in your business, but you've only budgeted $100? Can you help me make sense of that? Like, that doesn't make much sense. Help me understand this for you. And sometimes we find that it's important to them, but they don't have the budget because their business is failing. And really, they're putting all the pressure on you to save their business. And those are absolutely the worst kinds of customers. Not, again, from a malicious standpoint, like where they're, hard to work with, but because they are putting far too much of an expectation on you to run their business successfully when they are the ones who need to be running the business. A good example was today at our growth group, I was talking about this. We had a woman there who was selling logo designs. And I said, well, if you ask these questions and you say, how important is the logo to you? And they say, oh, it's the most important thing. And you say, what's your budget? And they say, all I have is $50. That's all I have. And this logo is so important because I need it to represent all these great things about my business. And, without it, I'm not going to sell anything and we're going to go under. We're going to fail. This is someone who is true. They're being honest in that their budget is only $50. They're broke. But also, it is very important to them. However, it's far too much of an expectation on you. I don't know about you, but I can't design a logo that's going to literally turn a business around. And from like even a consulting perspective, it's called good advice is the business. It's not really freaking great advice to take your business from zero and on the brink of death to now flourishing at 7 figures. At the end of the day, you still have to run your business. I'm a great advisor. I'm a great consultant. I'm going to lead you in the right direction, but I'm not going to run your business for you, right? So even having these kinds of conversations can help you avoid a customer who they bought, they finally got together enough of the money to buy the logo, to pay for the logo, and then they're mad that it didn't turn their business around. They leave you a 1-star review on Google. Or I had someone who, she asked about buying advertising on the podcast. I said, hey, this is typically what it costs. Do you have any sales yet? Like, how's your business looking? And she said, I don't have any sales yet. Or maybe she was just starting out. I can't remember. And so I was like, man, you're putting a lot of stock in this podcast ad. I love my listeners. I love the people who listen to the podcast. But hey, if I were you, I wouldn't be buying the podcast ad. I wouldn't. Now, if this is part of like a bigger picture perspective, like you're investing in a number of different things and the podcast is like one of those things, I totally get it. That's great. But if you're at 0 sales and you think the answer is the podcast, I'm flattered, but I can tell you it's probably not the right answer for you. I'm willing to turn away a customer like that, because I know they will be a far better customer down the road if I lead them in the right direction. If I'm honest and transparent with them and I turn down the sale today, and it's not even so much about them coming back around down the road. They may never come back around, but doing business that way, I have found gets you way better customers long-term than the kinds of customers you get when you're just chasing the dollar day after day after day. So asking the question, have you paid for this before? And then either what's your budget or how important is this to you? These are great starting points for getting better customers. And I'm going to move to wrap this up because my wife's called me a few times now on my cell phone. So I have to assume it's probably something important. The last question, and this is a little bit of a different question because it's not going to apply to everyone listening. The last question I like to ask, and it's kind of related to what I just said about the logo. The last question I like to ask, and this is more for the consulting side. I don't ask this for advertising. Well, sometimes I do a little bit, but I don't ask this at all for the podcast stuff. I ask, what's your revenue like? How's your business going? I had a woman who called for some consulting help. She said, and people always make the same joke. They always call and go, I need some good advice, which, it's the name, so I get it. So we were talking. She said, hey, I need to hire you. I need to hire a consultant. And I said, okay. What do you sell? And she said, I sell journals. And I said, great. Okay. How many have you sold? And she said, I've sold 12. And I said, okay. So like 12 today? Or she's like, no, I've sold 12 total. And I was like, total this year? And she's like only 12 I've sold. She's like, please stop making me say it so many different ways. And I go, okay, 12. Wow. Well, how long have you been in business? She's like, I've been in business for 3 years. So again, I'm flattered this person reached out, but this is a heads up. This is probably not a great customer for me. And I told her as much. I said, I don't think you need a consultant. I think you need to drastically retool your business. I think if you've sold only 12 journals in 3 years, there's something deeply wrong with the product. There's something really wrong with how you're selling this. Maybe you need to go back to square one of the journal and redesign it and look at it again and what have you. I don't know. But your time and attention would be better served there than it would be putting whatever dollars you have left into this consultant to come alongside you in your business. Now, can the argument be made that I probably would have been a great help? Like maybe she should have hired me? It's possible. In fact, I think I remember she ended up hiring someone anyway. So it was like, okay, well, there you go. But all that to say, when I have a better understanding of where my customer's coming from, it gives me all the better insight on if I'm actually a good fit for them or if I'm not. So what kinds of questions do you like to ask in your sales process? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know, blake@goodadvicecoaching.com. If you're enjoying the podcast and you're a first-time listener, what are you waiting on? Click that subscribe or follow button so you can keep getting good advice wherever you are. And for those of you who have supported the podcast, whether that's our Patreon or advertising on the show, I so appreciate you. It's been such a joy to promote our businesses on the podcast. All that to say, that's today's good advice. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.